Welcome back to the next installment of the Book of Ecclesiastes. We've been going through this book throughout the season of Lent, and we are now in chapter 8. We are actually getting to a new section, which we're going to be breaking up into 3 sections. We have here in chapters 8 and 9 a lengthy discourse on grim realities and injustice, the enigma of life, and the certainty of death. Very exciting stuff. Hooray! You could also look at this section as about authority, injustice, and faith. That's sort of the flow of thought in here. So we're going to deal with each of those sections in separate installments. So today we are looking at chapter 8, verses 2 through 9, particularly on the grim reality that is the earthly authority of kings. So, our reading. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I have observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Here ends the reading. So as I said in the introduction, we are looking at these verses and they are speaking to us about earthly authority. And it's not always very optimistic, not very positive. This is a rather pessimistic book much of the time, as I have repeated throughout this series, as Koheleth, our preacher, our author here, is exploring all the problems of this life. Maybe not all, but many of the problems of this life, and how they challenge the faithful to question and to wonder why this is, and ultimately prove that life from a purely worldly perspective is vanity, is meaningless, is fruitless or futile. So he begins in the first 3 verses, verses 2, 3, and 4, exploring how we are to regard authority rather specifically. And he does this both from a religious aspect as well as a political aspect. So religiously, in verses 2 and beginning of verse 3, he basically says, keep God's command keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. So he begins with the regular biblical assertion that God has established earthly authority, and therefore we should obey them. When it says, do not be hasty to go from his presence, he's referring to abandoning your post, being disloyal. Don't leave the king's cause. Don't walk away from him. Or at least do not be hasty to go from his presence. So we have this religious side to how we receive earthly authority, in which we recognize God has appointed our rulers, and it is right for us to obey them, and we should not be quick to disobey or to abandon them. Then Koheleth gives us a slightly more political side of how we are to regard authority. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he, the king, does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme. Who may say to him, what are you doing? So the king does whatever he pleases. His word is supreme. So don't put yourself in danger of his wrath by opposing or questioning him. This is just reasonable, logical advice, especially in the ancient world when absolute monarchy or absolute kings, whether it was hereditary or otherwise, was the standard form of government. So when the king's reign and word is supreme, arguing with the supreme ruler is a good way of getting yourself in a great deal of trouble. Best not, most of the time. Verses 5 through 8, then, are a bit more general. And again, like previous chapter or two, this is a bit more of a verse-by-verse collection of proverbs, but not random collections of proverbs, as in the Book of Proverbs, but particularly chosen to speak to this question of how to explain, understand, and receive authority. So in verse 5, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. So obedience to authority maintains their favor, will know no evil thing, but the wise follow the right procedures for dealing with problematic leaders. So we have one of our first outs, I guess you could say, for when there is a wicked king. The wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. There is a procedure. There is a course. There is recourse when there is need of opposing a king or other ruler. For there is a time and a way for everything, he says in verse 6, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. So here we have kind of an echo of chapter 3, perhaps the most famous part of this book. For everything there is a time and a purpose for everything under heaven. So here we have kind of an echo of that. There is a time and a way for everything. Once again, we're sort of gently acknowledging that when there is a problematic ruler, when there is a wicked king, there are ways to address that. Outright rebellion is usually not the way to go because you'll probably get killed. Nevertheless, the wise can discern how to proceed. And one of the other things, I should say, that gives us pause to contend with wicked rulers is our lack of foresight and our limitations as humans and as sinners in particular. And that's what the next two verses particularly direct us. Verse 7 asks the rhetorical question, "For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be?" So we don't have foreknowledge. We don't know the future, and we cannot know the future. So sometimes, if you think about history or recent history, you can think about overthrows, you can think about rebellions, you can think about military interventions and coups. And how many times have wicked rulers been replaced with even more wicked rulers? That certainly was not the intention in many of these cases, but that's what happened. So that's a good illustration for what Koheleth is pointing out here. We don't know how it is to be. No one can tell us how it will be. We don't know the future. And sometimes opposing a wicked ruler will only land us with an even more wicked ruler, and our situation will be worse than the first. So there is a time to rebel, and there is a time to be quiet. If we could add to the list in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 about a time for everything under heaven. Or perhaps this falls under what's actually there, a time for war and a time for peace. A time for killing and a time for healing. And he finishes with a longer proverb, verse 8, where he lists basically 4 powers that nobody has, including kings. We are all limited by these 4 things. No one has power to retain the Spirit, first of all. So no one can control the Spirit. And this refers both to the Holy Spirit, no one can control God, of course, But this is also about your own spirit. We are, after all, dual creatures. We're both physical and spiritual. You cannot control your spirit. Your earthly self, your bodily self, is at war with your spirit. You can't control your soul or spirit. And so there is this limitation here. Secondly, no one has power over the day of death. The day of our death is beyond our control. You cannot avoid it when it comes. When God calls you home, you go. When you get shot, you're dead. When you rebel against the king and he executes you, you're done. So there is a lack of power here. Or you get sick and there's nothing you can do. So we have just the reality of death that is over everyone. We can fight it, we can resist it, we can use medicine, we can do all the things that we do. But ultimately, death beats everybody. So no one can control that. That's a limitation. The third one in this verse, there is no discharge from war. This speaks particularly to, again, the cultural situation where if the king recruits you into the army and conscripts you, you can't say no. That's just the authority that the king has in the ancient Near East. But we can also receive this as a spiritual truth, which is true for everybody in all times. You cannot opt out of the spiritual war, the struggle of faith, the struggle against your sinful nature. This is unavoidable. There is no opt-out. You have sin. You have imperfect faith, and therefore there is a war. Therefore there is a struggle, and there is no discharge from that, apart from death. Hooray. And last of all in this verse, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. So there is no escape from wickedness, let alone by pursuing further wickedness. So these are limitations that speak to how we need to be careful with how we receive authority. We are ourselves sinful. We are ourselves limited. So it's one thing to look at a president, a prime minister, a governor, a king, an emperor, an empress, and say, well, that's a horrible leader. Let's get rid of him or her. Okay, that might be true. But you are also a horrible sinner. And you also are imperfect. And you also are going to die someday. Just as that horrible ruler is going to die someday. And you don't know if you're going to make things worse or better if you oust this ruler. So again, it takes great wisdom and discernment to work out how to proceed. Thus, the standard treatment and posture toward authority for the Christian is one of obedience. We recognize that God has appointed our kings and our other rulers and authorities over us, and we oppose them to our own peril. Occasionally there is time to remove them and to take action against them, but most of the time it is not wise, it is not discerning, and it is dangerous. All this I have observed, Koheleth says, as he sums up this section in verse 9. All this I have observed, while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. So, he's not making excuses for the absolute monarchies of his day. He's recognizing that man has power over man to his hurt. This ability to oppress one another is not good. He recognizes this. And there's also a delightful ambiguity, at least in English. Maybe I should have explored this in Hebrew more carefully with a more in-depth commentary. But there's a neat, curious question here when it says, man had power over man to his hurt. To whose hurt? I mean, the default reading probably would be to the hurt of the one who has, who's being oppressed. One person has power over someone else, and that someone else is hurt by this. That's most likely the reading here. But it's also very possible that man has power over man to his hurt. The one who is in control, the one who exerts authority, and the one who is oppressive also hurts himself. Because to be oppressive, to be a tyrant, to be a wicked ruler is a grave sin in and of itself. So really, power over man to his hurt is probably to everyone's hurt when there is such injustice. So that's also worth considering as we conclude this brief section. So just to conclude and summarize here, this passage is sound and godly advice. It's not based on heavenly perfect ideals as such. It's based on the hard realities of an unjust world. It's not necessarily right and good that an earthly ruler should have such absolute authority. But in a world where that is the case, this obedience and the slowness to object to his whims are prudent responses. These teachings, therefore, do translate a bit differently when we receive them in different political contexts. Most of the democratic world, for example, has a much more limited authority for presidents and for prime ministers. The power to make laws is spread out among one or more legislative bodies. Our obedience and loyalty in these instances are less to a single monarchical ruler and more perhaps to a constitutional system. To everything there is a season, yes, and it takes great wisdom to discern if, when, and how to chafe against the governmental system. But the Christian's default position, as I've said before, is one of patient obedience. Not because we're pushovers, but because our entire perspective is different. We are more concerned about eternity, and we are humble enough, or at least we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be humble enough to admit that we do not know what the future holds. And if a particular ruler or system is unfair, or even wicked, we know that such injustices will not last forever. But in faith, we look forward to the day when the Christ, the righteous and eternal King, at last exercises his perfect authority over all flesh, and everyone will bow to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Thanks be to God.